So this is our third week of a 5-week journey across the terrain of the whole Bible. We're moving from Genesis through to Revelation, and we're trying to survey the one story, the big story that holds the whole thing together. And as we do that, there were two questions to sort of bear in mind. The first one was, what is the story? What is the big story? And the second one is, can I believe it? Is it really true? And if it is really true, what difference should that make to me? In the first week, we looked at Genesis chapter 3. We saw that Adam and Eve, although they were with God in the garden, they were enjoying his company and just being with him in this beautiful place that he had created for them. They gave in to temptation. And as a result, their relationships with God, with creation, and with each other were broken. In response, God removed them from the garden. But he also said that he would send somebody who would rescue them. In week 2, we saw that God honored his promise. He sent Moses to rescue them from slavery in Egypt, and he took them through all the trials and tribulations into the promised land. God gave them laws so that they could be a light to the world of what it was like to be the people of God and to live as the people of God under God's rule and reign. That kind of looked as if we'd reached the end of the story. After all, they're in the promised land and everything was good. Well, it wasn't quite like that. Sometimes we prejudge or judge too quickly. And here's 4 folk of whom things have been said that turned out not to be quite true. Winston Churchill, in a school report, it was written, "He is a constant trouble to everybody. He is always in some scrape or other. He cannot be trusted to behave himself anywhere." Jilly Cooper, the novelist, her school report, "Jilly has set herself an extremely low standard, which she has failed to maintain." David Owen, now Lord Owen, former leader of the Lib Dems, his headmaster wrote, "If I had to select an expedition to the South Pole, he would be the first person I would choose, but I would make sure he wasn't on the return journey." Charlotte Bronte, her tutor wrote of her, "She writes indifferently and knows nothing of grammar." It should remind us not to judge people too quickly and too superficially. And neither should we judge this story too soon. Sometimes we mistake the journey for the destination. We do that with people. Sometimes we are too quick to write a person off, forgetting that they're on a journey. They haven't made it to the destination yet. At the end of our look at Exodus a couple of weeks ago, I mentioned that, as I said earlier, it would be possible to see the promised land as the ultimate destination for the people of God. God had called the Israelites to be his people. He had rescued them from slavery in Egypt. He gave them a land, job done, journey over, let's move on. But no, that's not what happened. This passage before us this morning actually comes years later in what is really Israel's golden age. It's also an age of disappointment. First point for today, just as a reminder, this is an age of construction. An age of construction. The journey through the Bible, we've reached some high hills this morning. From the valley of slavery in Egypt, the Israelites have traveled through into this point in their history where it is as good as it's ever going to be in terms of biblical history. They've settled in this small plot of land called Canaan. Despite tribal differences, there's essentially a family unity among them. They under the first kings, effectively form what is a united kingdom of Israel. Today's reading happens about the time of King Solomon, who had the temple built. As I say, it's the golden age of the Old Testament. Under Kings David and Solomon, there was a time of unity, of prosperity, of relative peace for that nation that they would never see again. For that reason, some critics dismiss as a sort of legendary story this David and Solomon. David, a kind of King Arthur figure. Solomon then also is merely, for many theologians and many academics, just a myth. But to do that plays fast and loose with the evidence. There is recent evidence in particular that brings back to history David and Solomon. Every so often, despite my better understanding, I do present a photo of a pile of stones. You know how it is. I'm not an expert in archaeology in any way, so I'm kind of trusting the research that I've done here. But this picture is a picture of part of what is now believed to be a huge palace dating from the time of David and Solomon. You see, one of the problems is that events from so long ago, from that time in history, they're hard to find direct evidence for. As time passes, the documents tend to disappear or to disintegrate because it was written on parchment or on plant material. So architecture tends to be the best that we can hope for. You see, even King Herod, who was around at the time of Jesus, 1,000 years or so after David, he's only really known from his building work and architecture in his day. If you visit and travel in the Holy Land today, you'll see some of these things. These were done by Herod. The top left and the middle are in the city of Caesarea, there on the coast. That's an aqueduct that he used to get fresh water, and a huge auditorium that was built. The top right is a model of the temple in David's day, which Herod essentially rebuilt. The bottom is Masada, and the bottom right-hand side is a kind of image of what his palace at Masada would look like. That's what he's famous for. That's what he is known for. Apart from coins bearing his name, there are no inscriptions of King Herod's name from his time. But nobody doubts his existence because there is evidence in archaeology of what he actually did. But both David and Solomon are still regularly dismissed as figures of myth. In the early 1990s, there was an astonishing discovery known as the Tel Dan Stele. That's an upright stone that is inscribed and used as a monument of an important event or an important achievement. Rulers and people from Egypt, Israel, across Mesopotamia, and that part of the world used these stones to commemorate their great victories and their accomplishments. This particular one is extraordinary because carved on its stone face are the words, House of David. Here we have an inscribed stone found in the Israeli city of Dan, dating to around 100 years of the life of King David. And it not only refers to the dynasty of David, but to the people of Israel. So this 3,000-year-old stone refers in Aramaic to the historical reality of King David. What about Solomon? What evidence do we have of his reign? During the 1960s, some interesting evidence surfaced. At 3 cities, a particular type of fortified gate was found. They're called 6-chambered gates, a very secure system of protecting and guarding a city. At Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer, 3 cities that are mentioned specifically in the Bible as having been fortified by Solomon. And here we have these 3 cities, all of whom have this particular style of fortification, which was unknown. It indicates that at the time of Solomon, there was wealth, there was central planning, and an intelligent system of defense being designed. They provide a degree, at least, of evidence for the existence of Solomon. But most famous in terms of history is the building work of the Great Temple. Since the Exodus, when the Israelites came out of Egypt, they've stored the Ark of the Covenant containing the stone tablets of the law in a portable tent called the Tabernacle. And it was Solomon who created a temple for them to stay permanently. Verse 6 of our reading says, "The priest then brought the Ark of the Lord's Covenant to its place in the inner sanctuary of the temple, the most holy place, and put it beneath the wings of the cherubim. It's interesting that the basic shape and structure of the temple or the tabernacle was not unique to Israel. There's an outer courtyard with an inner holy place and a small holy of holies behind it. It's all oriented eastwards, and it's something you find in structures outside of Israel. What was unique about this was not the structure of the temple, but what was at the heart of the temple. It was not a place that contained a throne for a king. It was not a place that contained a statue of a national god. What was at the heart of the temple for Solomon was the word of God, the commands that were given to Moses. That was the physical object that was placed in the Holy of Holies, as if to say they were not to worship a physical statue of God, but that they would worship God through his word. That's why Jews and Christians through the years have been known as people of the book. At the heart of Christian worship is a God who speaks, who communicates with his people. A God whom we know through his word. And so God makes himself known through his word, and yet the Israelites also had this visible, tangible sense of his presence. Verse 10 says this: when the priests withdrew from the holy place, the cloud filled the temple of the Lord, and the priests could not perform their service because of the cloud. For the glory of the Lord filled his temple. You know, wouldn't it be great if one day we came in here and couldn't perform our duties because the glory of the Lord filled the temple? Because we were simply overcome by his presence. God gives a physical sense of his presence in the temple. Where have we seen that cloud before? The cloud of his presence? Well, it's a reminder of the cloud that led the people in the wilderness. And now that cloud is filling the temple built by Solomon. It's what the Bible calls the glory of God. That word glory is kind of vague. We don't really understand it very well. But the Hebrew word for glory has a sense that means heaviness, or the felt weight of God, his glory. And so here he is amongst the people that he's called to himself in his temple. So the age of construction is a great age. It's a glorious age for the people. God is present among the people. And that leads us to the second point. It's an age of construction, but it's also an age of contentment. When critics ask for evidence of this period, it's worth noting how short-lived it is. Solomon's reign, the high point of ancient Israel, lasts for about 40 years. And even during that time, we know that Egypt launches a military campaign into the land. So it's 40 years, but even they are not without trouble. So don't be fooled into imagining that this golden age is a time when Israel has no troubles and no enemies, and it lasts for hundreds of years. It doesn't. It's a brief moment which passes very quickly in history. In fact, in the grand scheme of things, it's the blink of an eye. I think there's a reason for that, which is really important, and we'll come to in a minute. But you see, the evidence that people would really like to see for that time is evidence of the temple at the time of Solomon. Surely of all of the buildings of the Bible, that is the one that there must be evidence for. But there's a problem. Primarily there's a problem because the temple built by Solomon was demolished and rebuilt a few hundred years later. And then it was extensively remodeled by King Herod at the time of Jesus. And then it was demolished by the Romans, who built their own little temple on the same site, which was then in turn demolished. And when Islam arrived, they built their own monument on the top, which is now known as Temple Mount. It's now a holy place for Islam. And so you can't go digging about underneath to try and find evidence for something else. Makes archaeology very difficult. But there is a project called the Temple Mount Sifting Project, because the religious authorities who managed that site a number of years ago dug out underneath, and they put in new drainage and new electrics, and they took lorry loads. There you are, there's a picture with a lorry, in fact. They dug it out, and they took lorry loads away, and they dumped it in the Kidron Valley just outside Jerusalem. So the archaeological team have been working on sifting through the debris that's there to discover every little bit of fragment of stone or coin or weapons or whatever it is. Of course, it's all messed up. So it's incredibly difficult to find anything or to understand, even if you do, what it is. So I don't know that we'll ever really know about the temple at the time of Solomon. But what we do know is what is written in God's word in verses 14 and 15 of the reading. While the whole assembly of Israel was standing there, the king turned around and blessed them, and then he said, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who with his own hand has fulfilled what he promised with his own mouth to my father David." You see, the temple was the physical representation of God's faithfulness to his word. God had promised the temple, and he fulfilled his promise. God promised to live among his people, and he fulfilled his promise. God is true to his promises, and his word is always as good as his deed. In creation, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God said the Egyptians would be destroyed as they crossed the sea, and they were destroyed. God said that Israel would have a land and that he would dwell among them. And here he is in the temple. So this section of Bible history, this age of contentment, at one level is about the fulfillment of God's promises. 1 Kings 4:25 tells us, during Solomon's lifetime, Judah and Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, lived in safety, everyone under their own vine and under their own fig tree. God now has a people of his own and a land that they can call their own, with prosperity and relative security. They are under God's rule, and they know his presence. Just as God walked in the garden with Adam and Eve, now God in the cloud of his glory lives in the temple in the midst of his people. So no wonder Solomon can use the words of verse 20 in his prayer. The Lord has kept the promise he made. I have succeeded David my father, and now I sit on the throne of Israel just as the Lord promised, and I have built the temple for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. Yet again, it seems to me that we could stop right there. How does it get better than that? This is the place where people can have their sin forgiven. They can know that they're in right relationship with God. They have the temple. They know that their sacrifice can be offered, that their sins can be covered as they come before a holy God. Surely, this is where the story should end. This is the golden age, the ideal time to be living in Israel. However, the age of construction and contentment is also an age of compromise. I suppose because of the nature of the vote last week and all or nothing, there was very little in the way of compromise. It was us against them. And if you were one of them, you were the enemy. Superficial judgments were not remotely helpful. People voted in different ways for different reasons. Not all Leave voters are racist or xenophobic, and not all Remain voters are 20-something wine-loving, sauerkraut-munching travellers. It's too easy to label other people without knowing what they're thinking. So what's going on in this golden age for Israel? Are things all that they appear to be? Well, notice something else in Solomon's prayer in verse 27. But will God really dwell on earth? The heavens, even the highest heaven, cannot contain you. How much less this temple that I've built? Or as the Message puts it, can it be that God will actually move into our neighborhood? Now it's Solomon's turn to ask that really question that we've seen in the last two parts of the series. Can God really dwell on earth? It's a good question. We know that God demonstrated his presence in the temple. The felt sense of his glory was there, but he didn't literally live there. God fills all of space, and he cannot literally be limited to the tiny space in the temple. But I think there's more behind the question than that. It's not simply a question of physical space. There's a lot going on in this golden age that I haven't told you about yet. I haven't told you that Solomon married many wives and kept many mistresses. I haven't told you that they led him to worship other gods. I haven't told you that after his death the nation will break in two and that the northern kingdom will set up all sorts of false places of worship. I haven't told you that The northern kingdom will eventually be destroyed and be wiped out. That the small southern kingdom will set up alliances with pagan nations that will lead them astray. That the Ark of the Covenant will literally vanish altogether. That the remaining people who get the nickname Jews, short for Judah, their tribe, will be taken away into captivity. 300 years after Solomon, a prophet, a visionary in Israel, will see something very dramatic take place. Ezekiel 10:18. Then the glory of the Lord departed from over the threshold of the temple and stopped above the cherubim. It's true that a remnant will return, that a second temple will be built, but it's nothing compared to the temple of Solomon. The Jews will never again in biblical history be an independent nation. In the ancient world, they'll be ruled by the Persians, by the Greeks, and by the Romans. Can God really dwell in a temple, asks Solomon. No, not really. You see, if there's something this golden age of Solomon clearly reveals, it's that we have a problem not solved by a temple of stone. What's the greatest need? Freedom from slavery? Well, the Israelites got that in the Exodus, but they remain enslaved to their passions. A land of our own. Well, the Israelites got that, and look at it today. What about the needs that Solomon had met? Material wealth, wisdom, songwriting ability, buildings. Solomon had all of those. He had wives and mistresses. Do you think your greatest need today is a sexual partner? Is your greatest need today a religion, a temple of stone? Do you think your greatest need is for your career to be furthered so that you can be comfortable? We've climbed hills today to the golden age of Israel, and we've come to a false summit. If you're on a quest for happiness, you need to set your height higher. None of these things without Jesus are going to answer your deepest need. None of these things are going to address the problem of our broken relationship with God. Without Christ, they can never satisfy. Without Christ, they don't bring inner transformation. Without Christ, they don't bring complete forgiveness. Solomon proved it. Matthew 6:28, Jesus says this. And why do you worry about clothes? See how the flowers of the field grow? They don't labor or spin. And yet I tell you that not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. If that's how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, will he not much more clothe you? You of little faith. So don't worry saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? For the pagans run after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all of these things will be given to you as well. Don't seek money as the most important thing in your life. Don't seek religion hoping that it will address your deepest need. Don't seek position in the church or rely on church attending. Seek Jesus. Seek first the kingdom of God, that right relationship with God where our sin is forgiven. Seek what was lost in Genesis chapter 3. Relationship with God. Deep, personal, intimate relationship with God. It's where you belong. You belong in that right place with God. And without Christ, all those other things are worthless. But with Christ, we have our security and our hope. And all of the other things we need are added as well. So from this false summit, actually we can glimpse the real summit. And that real summit is another mountaintop, not capped by a temple of stone, but capped by a cross. Next week, we think about how Jesus fits into the one big story. Amen.